Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the most unexpected places. There's something powerful about witnessing a moment when someone chooses compassion over convenience, especially when nobody else is watching. At the dusty auction yard, 3 injured puppies sat in silence as folks walked past without a second glance. The auctioneer's voice grew quiet as he waited for any bid at all. That's when a weathered mountain man named Boone Carlyle stepped forward and said the words that would change everything. "I'll take them." Nobody knew why this solitary man would burden himself with 3 broken creatures. What would drive someone to rescue what others had given up on? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed Boone Carlyle's words hung in the dusty air like morning mist over a mountain lake. Every head in that auction yard turned his way, some with curiosity, others with the kind of judgment that comes easy to folks who measure a man's worth by his social graces. Boone didn't much care for their stares. He'd grown accustomed to being the subject of whispered conversations in the few times he ventured down from his mountain home. Standing 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of solitude, Boone cut an imposing figure, even in his weathered canvas jacket and worn denim. His beard, more silver than brown now at 53, framed a face that spoke of years spent under open sky and harsh weather. But it was his eyes that gave people pause, storm grey and steady, holding depths that suggested he'd seen more than his share of life's harder truths. The auctioneer, a thin man named Hartley, who'd been calling livestock sales for 30 years, cleared his throat nervously. "Well now, Mr. Carlyle, that's mighty kind of you, but these here pups, they're not exactly—" "I said I'll take them." Boone's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who didn't waste words. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting 3 $20 bills. More than fair for animals nobody else wanted. As he walked toward the makeshift pen where the puppies huddled together, Boone felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he made contact with the outside world. These trips to town were necessary but never comfortable. He preferred the honest communication of wind through pine trees and the straightforward needs of wild creatures who asked nothing more than to be left alone. The puppies looked up at him with eyes that had already learned not to hope too much. The smallest one, a mixed breed with one ear torn and healing badly, pressed closer to its companions. The limping pup, favoring its left front leg, watched Boone with the wariness of something that had been hurt by human hands before. The third, slightly larger but with ribs showing through matted fur, seemed to be protecting the other 2. Boone knelt down slowly, the way his father had taught him when approaching wounded animals. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice taking on the gentle tone he reserved for creatures that understood honesty better than humans did. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The memory of his father's voice echoed in his mind as he gently lifted each puppy, checking their injuries with hands that knew the difference between healing and harm. Samuel Carlyle had been a mountain man too, back when such men were more common and less curiosity than they were now. He'd raised Boone with a deep respect for all living things and an understanding that sometimes the most damaged creatures made the most loyal companions. "Son," his father had told him once, while they tended to a wolf with its leg caught in a trap, "there's a difference between helping something heal and trying to fix what can't be fixed. The trick is knowing which is which and having the patience for both." Samuel's old trapping journal, bound in cracked leather and filled with his careful observations about animal behavior and wilderness healing, still sat on Boone's kitchen table. The pages were yellow with age now, but the wisdom remained as fresh as the day it was written. Detailed notes about which plants soothed infections, how to set bones properly, when to push an animal toward recovery, and when to let nature take its course. The drive back to his mountain home took 40 minutes on winding roads that climbed steadily through pine and aspen forests. Boone had fashioned a comfortable nest in a cardboard box on his passenger seat, where the 3 puppies rode in relative quiet. Occasionally one would whimper softly, but mostly they seemed to understand that this journey was different from whatever had brought them to the auction yard. Boone's cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view that stretched across 3 valleys to the snow-capped peaks beyond. He'd built it himself over the course of 2 summers, using timber from his own land and techniques his father had passed down. It wasn't large, just a main room with a stone fireplace, a simple kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a workshop where he crafted the furniture and tools that supplied his modest needs. The life he'd carved out here was deliberate in its simplicity. Solar panels provided enough electricity for basic needs, a well-supplied clean mountain water, and a large garden fed him through the growing season. He hunted when necessary, fished the streams that ran through his property, and preserved enough food each fall to last through the harsh mountain. Winters, it was a life that suited a man who'd learned that solitude was preferable to the complications that came with letting people get too close. Boone had tried the conventional path once: marriage, family, a job in town that paid well, but felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. That experiment had ended in the kind of tragedy that teaches a man the true cost of caring too deeply. But as he carried the 3 puppies into his cabin, settling them near the warmth of the fireplace, Boone felt something stirring that he hadn't experienced in years. Maybe it was the way the injured one looked at him without fear, or how the protective one seemed to relax once it realized no harm would come to its companions. Whatever it was, it reminded him of why his father's journal was filled with notes about healing rather than just surviving. The evening routine that followed was one Boone had never performed before, yet it felt strangely familiar. He warmed milk in a small pot, checking the temperature the way he'd seen his grandmother do when bottle-feeding orphaned calves. He prepared a soft bedding area, using old flannel shirts that still held the scent of wood smoke and mountain air. He moved slowly and spoke quietly, giving the puppies time to understand that this place was different from wherever they'd been before. As darkness settled over the mountains and the fire burned low in the grate, Boone found himself sitting on the floor beside the makeshift bed, watching 3 small forms sleep more peacefully than they probably had in weeks. The largest puppy had positioned itself between the other 2 and the rest of the room, even in sleep maintaining its protective stance. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, with the sound that had lullabied Boone to sleep for most of his adult life. But tonight, that familiar whisper was joined by something new, the soft breathing of creatures who had trusted him enough to let their guard down completely. It was a sound that reminded him of what his father used to say about the responsibility that comes with being trusted by something that has been broken. When a wounded thing lets you close enough to help. Samuel had written in his journal, "You're not just tending to their injury. You're promising that the world still has room for healing." As Boone finally rose to bank the fire and prepare for bed, he glanced once more at the sleeping puppies. Tomorrow would bring the real work of assessment and care, of learning what each one needed to heal properly. But tonight, it was enough that they were warm, fed, and safe. It was enough that none of them had to face the darkness alone. Dawn brought clarity that the auction yard's dim lighting had mercifully obscured. As morning sun streamed through the cabin windows, Boone could see the full extent of what he'd taken on. The smallest puppy, a mix of breeds that spoke to a hard life on the streets, was in worse shape than he'd realized. What he'd taken for simple exhaustion was actually something more serious. The little one's breathing was shallow and labored, its gums pale when Boone gently lifted its lip to check. The torn ear was infected, angry red around the edges, and giving off the sweet, sickly smell that meant antibiotics were needed soon. But it was the way the puppy couldn't seem to get comfortable, shifting constantly and whimpering softly, that told Boone this was beyond simple injury. His veterinary medicine kit, assembled over years of caring for wild animals and the occasional injured livestock from neighboring ranches, contained basic supplies: antiseptic, gauze, splinting materials, and a few antibiotics he'd managed to acquire through a sympathetic vet in the valley. But looking at the smallest puppy now, Boone realized he might be in over his head. The other two were watching him with intense focus, as if they understood their companion needed help they couldn't provide. The limping pup had positioned itself close to the sick one, offering what comfort it could. The largest, despite its own obvious hunger and fatigue, remained alert and protective. Boone knelt beside them, his hands gentle as he performed a more thorough examination than the previous night had allowed. The smallest puppy's left side felt wrong, too soft in places, too hard in others. Internal injuries, possibly from being kicked or struck. The kind of damage that could worsen quickly if not addressed properly. "What happened to you, little one?" Boone murmured, though he could guess. Rural areas were full of people who saw unwanted animals as problems to be solved with boots and sticks rather than compassion and care. He'd found enough beaten dogs over the years to recognize the signs. The memory came unbidden, as painful memories often do when triggered by present circumstances. Another small creature years ago that he hadn't been able to save. Sarah's kitten, found after the accident, injured but alive. Boone had tried everything he knew, but without proper medical care, without the resources a veterinarian could provide. The little orange tabby had died in his hands 3 days later, just like Sarah herself had died, just like their unborn child had died, like everything he'd tried to protect and failed to save. The familiar tightness gripped his chest, the same crushing weight that had driven him to these mountains in search of a life simple enough that failure couldn't destroy anything that mattered. But here he was again, holding something fragile and broken, feeling the terrible responsibility of being trusted by a creature that couldn't understand the limitations of human care. For a moment, Boone considered his options. He could take the puppy to the veterinary clinic in town, but that would mean explanations he wasn't prepared to give and interactions he wasn't equipped to handle. The young vet, Dr. Martinez, was competent but curious. The kind of person who asked questions about how injuries occurred and whether proper documentation had been filed, or he could try to handle this himself, using what his father had taught him and what he'd learned through necessity over the years. The risk was obvious. Without proper equipment and medications, the puppy might not survive. But sometimes mountain medicine worked when conventional treatment failed. Sometimes patience and careful attention could accomplish what high-tech procedures couldn't. The puppy opened its eyes and looked directly at Boone, a gaze that seemed far too wise for such a young creature. In that moment, Boone made his decision. Not the safe choice, not the easy choice, but the only choice that honored the trust this small life had placed in him. "All right then," he said softly, his voice carrying the same quiet determination that had gotten him through every crisis his mountain life had presented. "We'll do this together." The first step was stabilization. Boone carefully palpated the puppy's abdomen, searching for signs of internal bleeding or organ damage. What he found wasn't encouraging. The little one's belly was distended and tender, suggesting fluid accumulation that could indicate serious internal injury. From his medical kit, he retrieved a small vial of antibiotics and calculated a dose appropriate for the puppy's weight. The injection went smoothly, the little one barely flinching at the needle's prick. Next came pain medication, carefully measured to provide relief without causing dangerous sedation. The other two puppies watched every movement, their eyes tracking Boone's hands as if memorizing his techniques. The limping one seemed particularly interested, tilting its head and moving closer when Boone began cleaning the infected ear. As he worked, Boone found himself talking to them in the low, steady voice his father had used when tending injured animals. "The thing about healing," he explained, "applying antibiotic ointment with careful precision, is that it takes its own time. Can't rush it, can't force it. All you can do is create the right conditions and wait." The infected ear cleaned up better than expected once the crusted drainage was removed. Beneath the mess was healthy pink tissue that suggested the body was already fighting the infection. With antibiotic support, this injury would likely heal completely, but the internal damage remained a mystery that only time would reveal. Boone fashioned a comfortable nest, using his softest flannel shirts, positioning the sick puppy where it could rest without pressure on its injured side. He set up a feeding station with small amounts of easily digestible food and fresh water within easy reach. The afternoon passed in careful observation. Boone found himself checking on his patients every few minutes, watching for changes in breathing, looking for signs of improvement or deterioration. It was exhausting work, the kind of vigilant caretaking that demanded complete attention and offered no guarantee of success. As evening approached, the smallest puppy managed to eat a small amount of soft food and drink some water. Encouraging signs, but not enough to ease Boone's worry. The real test would come in the next 24 hours, when the body either began to heal or succumbed to injuries too severe for mountain medicine to address. The other two puppies had eaten well and were showing remarkable improvement already. The limping one's gait was steadier, suggesting the injury was muscular rather than structural. The largest pup had lost much of its defensive wariness, allowing Boone to handle it without the tension that had marked their first interactions, but it was the sick one that held Boone's attention as night fell over the mountains. The puppy had positioned itself so it could see both Boone and its companions, as if drawing strength from the presence of others who understood what it meant to be vulnerable and dependent on kindness. Boone settled into his rocking chair beside the fireplace, close enough to monitor his patients, but far enough away to avoid overwhelming them with too much attention. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming snow, reminding him that winter was approaching and decisions would need to be made soon about the future. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, his responsibility was simpler and more immediate, to create a space where healing could happen, where trust could grow, and where three broken creatures could learn that the world still contained pockets of safety. As the fire burned low and the cabin settled into the quiet rhythms of mountain evening, Boone found himself hoping, despite every lesson experience had taught him about the dangers of hope, that this time would be different. This time, he might actually be enough to save what mattered. The next morning brought the first real sign of hope. When Boone checked on his patients at dawn, the smallest puppy had managed to sleep through the night without the restless shifting that had worried him so deeply. Its breathing was stronger, more regular, and when Boone gently examined the injured side, the swelling seemed less pronounced. "Well now," he murmured, allowing himself a cautious smile. "Looks like you're tougher than you appear." Establishing routines had always been Boone's way of managing uncertainty. In the mountains, survival often depended on consistent habits that didn't rely on mood or motivation. So he set about creating a schedule that would give structure to both his life and the recovery process his unexpected guests required. From his workshop, he retrieved a hand-carved wooden bowl that his grandfather had made decades ago. The pine was smooth from years of use, darkened with age, but still solid and beautiful. His grandfather, old Pete Carlyle, had been a man who believed in doing things properly, even when no one was watching. "A thing made right lasts longer than the man who made it," he used to say, while teaching young Boone the patience required for careful craftsmanship. The bowl was perfect for the puppy's feeding station. Boone filled it with fresh water and positioned it where all three could reach it easily. For food, he prepared small portions of easily digestible fare, soft rice mixed with bits of cooked chicken, supplemented with goat's milk he'd been saving for his own occasional treats. The largest puppy, which Boone had begun thinking of as the guardian, approached the food first, but waited until its smaller companions had eaten their fill before taking its own share. This behavior spoke to a depth of character that impressed the mountain man. In his experience, animals that protected others despite their own vulnerability often possessed an inner strength that humans would do well to emulate. The limping pup, clearly the most curious of the three, watched everything Boone did with intense interest. When he changed the dressing on the smallest one's infected ear, the limping pup positioned itself where it could observe the entire process. Its own limp was indeed improving, What had seemed like a serious injury was proving to be a deep bruise and strained muscle that responded well to rest and gentle movement. As Boone worked, memories of his childhood surfaced unbidden. His father's patient voice explaining the principles of animal care, the importance of reading body language, and respecting the pace of healing. Samuel Carlyle had possessed an almost mystical ability to understand what wild creatures needed, when to intervene, and when to step back and let nature do its work. Every animal tells you what it needs. Samuel had taught him during a summer when 8-year-old Boone was helping nurse an injured hawk back to health. The trick is learning how to listen with more than just your ears. Now, watching the 3 puppies navigate their morning routine, Boone found himself applying those long-ago lessons. The smallest one's careful movements told him the internal injuries were healing, but still tender. The guardian's protective positioning revealed a creature that had learned responsibility early and carried it as naturally as breathing. The curious one's improving mobility suggested resilience and adaptability that would serve it well in whatever life lay ahead. But even as he observed their progress, Boone felt the familiar internal war between engagement and self-protection. Part of him wanted to remain clinical, detached, treating this as a temporary rescue operation that would end when the puppies were healthy enough to be placed elsewhere. That was the safe approach, the one that protected his carefully constructed solitude. Another part of him, a part he'd tried to bury after Sarah's death, responded to their presence with something approaching joy. The way they looked for him when he entered the room, the gradual relaxation in their postures as they learned to trust his approach. The small signs of personality emerging as fear gave way to curiosity. The afternoon brought an unexpected challenge that tested both his medical skills and his emotional resolve. The smallest puppy, despite its morning improvement, suddenly took a turn for the worse. What had seemed like successful stabilization gave way to labored breathing and a return of the restless discomfort that had marked its first night in the cabin, Boone's. Hand shook slightly as he examined the little one again, searching for signs of what might have changed. The infection in the ear was clearly responding to treatment, and the external injuries showed no signs of deterioration. But something inside was still wrong, still fighting the body's attempts to heal. From his father's journal, he recalled notes about internal injuries in small animals, the way trauma could create complications that appeared days after the initial insult. Fluid accumulation, organ damage that manifested slowly, the delicate balance between supportive care and harmful intervention. Sometimes, his father had written in careful script, the kindest thing is to let go, but knowing when that time has come requires wisdom I'm still learning to trust. Boone found himself facing that terrible decision. The puppy was suffering despite his best efforts, and conventional veterinary care might be its only real chance. But taking it to town would mean exposing himself to questions he wasn't ready to answer. Interactions that would shatter the careful isolation he'd built around his grief, as if sensing his internal struggle. The other 2 puppies moved closer to their sick companion. The guardian positioned itself protectively, while the curious one began what could only be described as grooming behavior, gently licking the smaller pup's face and ears with tender precision. The sight broke something loose in Boone's chest, emotion he'd kept carefully locked away for 3 years. These creatures, despite their own trauma and uncertainty, were offering comfort to their companion in the only way they knew how. They weren't calculating odds or protecting themselves from disappointment. They were simply being present with suffering, offering what they had to give. "All right," Boone said quietly, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're all in this together." He prepared another injection of antibiotics, this time adding a mild diuretic to address what he suspected might be fluid retention around the injured organs. It was a calculated risk, the kind of field medicine his father had sometimes employed when conventional options weren't available. The puppy accepted the injection without struggle, as if it understood that this strange, gentle giant was trying to help. Afterward, Boone positioned himself on the floor beside the makeshift bed, close enough to monitor breathing and comfort level without crowding. The curious pup approached him cautiously, then surprised Boone by settling against his leg. The warmth of the small body, the trust implicit in the gesture, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through the mountain man. When was the last time a living creature had sought comfort from his presence? As evening settled over the mountains, Boone found himself talking to the puppies in a way he hadn't spoken to another living thing since Sarah's death. Not the clinical observations of a caregiver, but the rambling, gentle conversation of someone who was no longer entirely alone. "You know," he said softly, watching the smallest pup finally settle into what appeared to be comfortable sleep. "My father always said that healing happens best when nobody has to do it alone." Outside, the wind moved through the pines with its familiar voice, but tonight it seemed less like the sound of solitude and more like a lullaby meant for four souls learning to trust each other in the quiet sanctuary of the mountain cabin. 3 days into their recovery, the puppies had transformed Boone's carefully ordered life in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had once been a cabin, governed by solitude and routine, now hummed with the energy of small lives learning to trust again. The smallest one, whom Boone had begun calling Scout for its alert, intelligent eyes, had turned the corner definitively. The internal injuries were healing, and the infected ear was responding beautifully to treatment. It was while cleaning out his desk drawer that afternoon, searching for additional medical supplies, that Boone's fingers found the photograph he'd forgotten was there. The worn paper, creased from years of handling, showed Sarah's face in profile as she laughed at something beyond the camera's range. Beside her, barely visible in the frame, was the gentle curve of her 6-month pregnancy. The image hit him like a physical blow, as fresh and devastating as the day he'd first learned they were gone. Sarah Martineau Carlyle, 31 years old, full of plans for the nursery they were building and names they were still debating. The drunk driver who'd run the red light had taken both of them in an instant, leaving Boone with a grief so complete it had driven him from everything that reminded him of human connection. He set the photograph on the kitchen table with trembling hands, then looked at the 3 puppies who were watching him with concern. They seemed to sense rather than understand. The guardian had raised its head from where it rested, ears alert to the change in Boone's breathing. Scout, despite still being weak, had managed to lift its head as if offering support. The curious one, whom Boone had started calling Ranger for its tendency to explore every corner of the cabin, approached slowly and pressed against his leg. "I'm sorry," Boone whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Sarah's memory or to the puppies for the sadness that had suddenly filled the room. "I didn't mean for you to see me like this," but as the words left his mouth, something shifted in his understanding. These 3 creatures had seen him exactly as he was, broken, grieving, struggling to heal from wounds that had never properly closed. And they had chosen to trust him anyway, to accept his care despite his obvious damage. The realization brought the first genuine smile Boone had felt in 3 years. Not the polite expression he wore during necessary trips to town, but something that came from a place he'd thought was permanently closed. Scout, as if responding to this change in emotional weather, managed a weak tail wag that was the first real sign of joy the little one had shown. "You know what?" Boone said, his voice stronger now. "Maybe it's time we all started talking to each other properly." He'd been speaking to them for days, of course, but always in the careful, distant tone of a caretaker maintaining professional boundaries. Now looking at Sarah's photograph and feeling the warmth of Ranger pressed against his leg, those boundaries seemed less important than the honesty these creatures deserved. "That's my wife," he told them, gesturing toward the photograph. "Sarah, you would have liked her. She had a way with animals. Could gentle a spooked horse faster than anyone I ever knew. And she was going to be a mother." His voice caught slightly on the words, but he continued. "They died in a car accident 3 years ago. That's why I live up here alone. Or at least, that's why I lived alone until you 3 showed up." The guardian moved closer, settling beside Boone's chair with the patient presence of a creature that understood grief without needing explanations. Scout, using reserves of strength Boone was amazed it possessed, managed to crawl closer to the group. Ranger maintained its position against Boone's leg, offering the simple comfort of shared warmth. For the first time since the accident, Boone found himself talking about Sarah without the crushing weight of loss overwhelming everything else. He told them about her laugh, how she'd insisted on naming every animal they encountered during their hiking trips. He described the plans they'd made for their child, the way Sarah had talked to her growing belly, as if the baby could already understand every word. "She would have taken you three in without a second thought," he said, gently stroking Scout's head. "Probably would have had you sleeping in our bed within a week, spoiled rotten with homemade treats and custom-built doghouses." As he spoke, Boone noticed changes in his patients that went beyond physical healing. The wariness that had marked their first days was giving way to something that looked remarkably like affection. They sought out his presence now, following him around the cabin when they were strong enough, settling near his chair when he read in the evenings. The transformation wasn't limited to the puppies. Boone found himself looking forward to their feeding times, to the small rituals of care that had become the structure around which his days revolved. When Scout managed to eat a full meal without assistance, Boone felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. When Ranger discovered that the fireplace tools made interesting chiming sounds when investigated with a curious nose, Boone laughed out loud for the first time in years. The Guardian's protective instincts had evolved as well. Initially focused solely on defending its companions, it now seemed to consider Boone part of the pack that required watching over. When Boone spent long periods working on repairs or tending to medical tasks, the Guardian positioned itself where it could observe both the activities and potential approaches to the cabin. Evening brought the ritual that had become Boone's favorite part of the day. After the last feeding and medical check, he would settle into his reading chair while the three puppies arranged themselves nearby. Scout, still requiring extra rest, usually claimed the warmest spot near the fireplace. Ranger explored until exhaustion overcame curiosity, then collapsed wherever sleep found it. The Guardian maintained its vigilant position, though Boone noticed it was allowing itself to relax more each night. "You know what I think?" Boone said as he opened his father's journal to read the evening's entry. "I think maybe healing isn't something you do alone after all." Outside, snow began to fall for the first time that season, dusting the pines with white and reminding Boone that winter was approaching. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and filled with the gentle sounds of creatures learning to trust again, the coming cold seemed less like a challenge to endure and more like a season to be shared. For the first time since Sarah's death, Boone found himself thinking about the future not as something to survive, but as something that might actually hold possibilities worth anticipating. The old radio in Boone's kitchen had been silent for months, its antenna bent from a summer storm he'd never bothered to repair. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet, finding all the information he needed in the language of wind and weather, the behavior of wild animals, the subtle changes that marked the mountain's seasonal rhythms. But something made him straighten the antenna that morning. Perhaps a subconscious need to reconnect with the world beyond his healing sanctuary. Static crackled through the speakers before resolving into the familiar voice of Jim Weatherby, the local station's morning host. Boone had known Jim since high school, back when they'd both believed the world was full of possibilities that wouldn't require leaving the valley that had shaped them. And folks, we're looking at what meteorologists are calling a historically severe winter system moving in from the northwest. Jim's voice carried the serious tone reserved for weather that could kill the unprepared. The National Weather Service has issued blizzard warnings for elevations above 6,000 feet, with snowfall totals potentially reaching 4 to 6 feet over the next week. Boone's cabin sat at 7,200 feet. He glanced at the three puppies, who were sprawled in various stages of recovery near the fireplace. Scout had graduated to short walks around the cabin's interior, though still tired easily. Ranger was investigating everything with renewed energy, having discovered that Boone's bootlaces made excellent toys. The Guardian maintained its watchful presence, now healthy enough to accompany Boone on brief trips outside, but never venturing far from its companions. The storm system is expected to arrive Thursday evening, with winds gusting up to 70 miles per hour, Jim continued. Emergency services are advising residents in remote areas to ensure they have adequate supplies for extended isolation. Thursday was tomorrow. Boone's winter preparations were normally completed by October, but this year his attention had been focused elsewhere. His woodshed was only half full, his emergency food stores depleted from feeding his unexpected guests, and most critically, his propane reserves were running low. The heating system that supplemented his fireplace during the worst weather would need fuel to keep the cabin warm enough for recovering animals. More concerning was Scout's condition. While dramatically improved, the smallest pup was still fragile, requiring consistent warmth and regular medication. A power outage during a severe storm could prove fatal if the cabin's temperature dropped too quickly. The practical mountain man, who had survived countless harsh winters, knew exactly what needed to be done. Drive to town immediately, stock up on supplies, arrange for propane delivery before the roads became impassable. It was a routine he'd followed for years without concern or complication, but the protective guardian who had emerged over the past week faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of his carefully constructed isolation. Taking the puppies with him meant exposing them to cold and stress their recovery couldn't afford. Leaving them meant abandoning creatures who had learned to depend on his presence, violating the trust that had become the foundation of their healing. "I've got to go to town," he told them, kneeling beside their makeshift bed. "Just for supplies? I'll be back before dark." The guardian's ears perked at his serious tone, and Scout managed to lift its head with concerned eyes. Ranger abandoned its bootlace investigation to join the group, sensing that something important was being discussed. Boone spent the next hour preparing the cabin for his absence. He built up the fire to ensure warmth would last through the afternoon, arranged food and water within easy reach, and left his father's journal open to pages about emergency animal care, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps because the written wisdom made his presence feel less completely absent. The drive to town usually took 40 minutes, but snow had already begun falling, adding treacherous conditions to roads that were challenging under the best circumstances. Boone found his attention split between navigation and worry about the 3 lives he'd left behind. When had their welfare become so central to his peace of mind? Thompson's general store was crowded with other mountain residents making last-minute preparations. Boone moved through the familiar routine of winter shopping: canned goods, batteries, medical supplies, kerosene for backup lighting. But he found himself adding items that would never have appeared on his solitary shopping lists: soft blankets, premium dog food, toys that might entertain recovering puppies during long storm days. "Heard you took in some strays from the auction," said Martha Thompson, the store owner's wife, as she rang up his purchases. Martha had been Sarah's friend, one of the few people who still acknowledged Boone's existence with genuine warmth rather than cautious curiosity. 3 puppies, Boone admitted, surprised by how easily the words came. They needed help. "Sarah always said you had a good heart for creatures that needed rescuing." Martha smiled, and for once the mention of his wife's name brought comfort rather than pain. "She'd be proud of you for taking them in." The propane supplier was less encouraging. "Storms moving faster than predicted," explained Tom Rodriguez, whose family had been delivering fuel to mountain homes for 3 generations. "We can get a truck up to you this afternoon, but it'll be the last run until this weather clears. Could be a week or more." An unexpected voice from behind him said, "I'm heading up that way anyway." "I could follow the propane truck, make sure everything goes smoothly." Boone turned to see Dr. Elena Martinez, the young veterinarian who had recently taken over the practice from old Doc Henderson. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of confident competence that came from training supplemented by genuine care for her patients. "That's not necessary," Boone began. But she held up a hand. "Actually, it is. Word gets around in a town this size, and I heard about your rescue operation. I've been hoping you'd bring them in for proper examination, but since you haven't, maybe I should come to them." The suggestion terrified and relieved Boone in equal measure. Professional veterinary care for the puppies would ease his constant worry about complications he might miss. But allowing another person into his sanctuary would shatter the isolation that had protected him for 3 years. "They're not social animals," he said carefully. "Might not react well to strangers." "Then it's a good thing I'm not a stranger to scared creatures," Dr. Martinez replied with a smile that reminded Boone of Sarah's confident warmth. "Besides, with weather like this coming, it makes sense to check on them before we're all snowed in for a week." As if to emphasize her point, the wind outside picked up, rattling the store's windows and sending snow swirling across the parking lot. The storm was arriving ahead of schedule, and decisions needed to be made quickly. Boone looked at his supplies, thought about the 3 trusting faces waiting for his return, and felt the weight of responsibility that extended beyond his own survival for the first time in years. "All right," he said finally. "But we leave now before this gets worse." Dr. Martinez followed Boone's truck up the winding mountain road in a small SUV, both vehicles crawling through snow that was falling heavier with each passing mile. The propane delivery truck had made it to the cabin and gone, leaving Boone's fuel reserves topped off just as the storm began to intensify. But now, as they pulled into his clearing, Boone wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake in allowing someone into the world he'd built around his grief. The puppies greeted his return with obvious relief, Scout managing a few tail wags, while Ranger bounded toward the door, with energy that spoke to remarkable recovery. The Guardian positioned itself between the newcomer and its pack, alert but not aggressive, a response that told Boone his patients were learning to trust his judgment about who posed a threat. "Oh my," Dr. Martinez said softly as she entered the cabin, taking in the careful arrangement of bedding, food stations, and medical supplies. "This is quite a setup you have here." From her veterinary bag, she withdrew items that immediately caught Boone's attention. A small leather pouch, decorated with beadwork in traditional Native American patterns. The medicine pouch had been a gift from her mentor, Dr. Sarah Crowfeather, who had taught her that healing often required more than textbook knowledge. "Some of the best animal medicine I've learned came from tribal elders," she explained, noticing Boone's interest. "Plants and techniques that have been working for centuries, long before we had fancy equipment and synthetic drugs." The pouch contained dried herbs Boone recognized from his father's journal: willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, comfrey for healing wounds. But there were others he'd only read about: sage for cleansing, sweetgrass for spiritual protection, cedar for purification. The scent that rose from the opened pouch carried the same earthy wisdom that permeated his father's old writings. "Your father was Samuel Carlyle," Dr. Martinez said, settling carefully onto the floor where the puppies could approach her at their own pace. Dr. Crowfeather mentioned him, said he understood animal healing in ways that couldn't be taught in veterinary school. Boone felt a familiar tightness at the mention of his father, but this time it carried pride alongside the grief. He had a way with wild things. Always said conventional medicine was just one tool in a bigger toolkit. As Dr. Martinez examined each puppy with gentle thoroughness, Boone found himself relaxing, despite his instinctive wariness of strangers. Her touch was patient and respectful, allowing each animal to set the pace of interaction. Scout, still the most fragile, accepted her examination with the trust of a creature that had learned to recognize healing intentions. "You've done exceptional work," she said, after completing her assessment. "Scout's internal injuries are healing beautifully, better than I might have expected with conventional treatment alone. The ear infection is completely resolved, and all 3 are showing excellent progress toward full recovery." Her words brought a relief Boone hadn't realized he needed. Despite his growing confidence in the puppy's improvement, some part of him had remained terrified that he was missing something crucial, that his mountain medicine might prove inadequate when professional expertise became available. "There is one concern," Dr. Martinez continued, her tone growing serious. I've been getting reports from the county about animal control issues. Someone's been calling in complaints about possible hoarding situations, neglect cases that need investigation. The words hit Boone like a physical blow. His sanctuary, the healing space he'd created for creatures that needed safety, suddenly felt vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated. They're not specific reports, she hastened to add, seeing his expression. But there's a new social worker, Linda Chen, who's been quite aggressive about following up on any tips about animal welfare. She's young, eager to make a difference, and not always careful about distinguishing between genuine problems and situations like yours. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow swirling past in sheets that obscured the view beyond a few feet. The storm was arriving with the ferocity the radio had predicted, and anyone caught on the mountain roads now would be trapped until it passed. The timing might actually work in your favor, Dr. Martinez said, glancing toward the windows. This weather will keep any official visits at bay for at least a week. But when it clears, you might want to be prepared for questions. Boone felt the walls of his carefully constructed world threatening to close in. The isolation that had protected him from human complications was now making him vulnerable to misunderstandings he couldn't control. 3 rescued puppies healing beautifully under his care could be misconstrued as evidence of problems that didn't exist. What kind of questions? He asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Standard welfare checks. Adequate food, water, shelter, medical care. Documentation of veterinary treatment. Evidence that the animals aren't suffering from neglect or abuse. She paused, watching Ranger investigate her medical bag with obvious curiosity. All things you're clearly providing, but bureaucracy doesn't always recognize unconventional excellence. The puppies seemed to sense the tension in the conversation. Scout moved closer to Boone, settling against his leg with the protective instinct that had developed over their weeks together. The Guardian positioned itself where it could watch both adults while maintaining visual contact with its companions. Ranger, perhaps picking up on the nervous energy, began what appeared to be an attempt to lighten the mood by bringing Boone one of his bootlaces. There might be a solution, Dr. Martinez said thoughtfully. If I were to document their condition officially, provide written verification of proper care and medical treatment, it would be much harder for anyone to claim neglect or abuse. The offer represented exactly the kind of human entanglement Boone had spent 3 years avoiding. Official documentation meant forms, records, the possibility of future visits and ongoing oversight. It meant allowing the outside world to have a stake in the life he'd built. But looking at the 3 trusting faces that had become the center of his daily existence, Boone realized his priorities had shifted without his conscious decision. Their safety mattered more than his comfort with isolation. Their future was worth the risk of letting someone else into his carefully guarded world. What would that involve? He asked. A thorough examination, which I've essentially already done. Some photographs for documentation. A written report confirming proper care and facilities. She smiled at Scout, who had ventured close enough to sniff her extended hand. And maybe occasional follow-up visits to ensure continued welfare. Outside, the storm continued to build, promising the kind of weather that could isolate the mountain for days. But inside the warm cabin, with 3 healing creatures and 1 cautious ally, Boone found himself considering the possibility that isolation might not be the only form of protection worth having. Sometimes, he was beginning to understand. Safety required accepting help from others who shared your commitment to healing. The storm raged for 3 days, turning Boone's mountain into a world of white silence, broken only by howling wind and the comfortable sounds of life inside the cabin. Dr. Martinez had been forced to stay, her vehicle buried under drifts that made travel impossible. What could have been an uncomfortable intrusion into Boone's privacy had instead become something unexpected, companionship that felt natural rather than forced. She proved to be an ideal guest, helping with the puppy's care while respecting the routines Boone had established. Her presence seemed to accelerate their healing, perhaps because it demonstrated that their world now included multiple sources of safety and care. Scout had grown strong enough to venture outside briefly, though it preferred to stay close to the cabin's warmth. Ranger's curiosity had expanded to include this new human, who proved to have fascinating medical equipment that made interesting sounds. The Guardian accepted her as part of the extended pack, though it maintained its protective vigilance. On the morning the snow finally stopped, Dr. Martinez helped Boone dig out her vehicle while the puppies supervised from the cabin's porch. The silence that followed the storm was profound, the kind of mountain quiet that made every sound sharp and clear. It was into this silence that the rumble of an approaching vehicle carried with unusual clarity. Boone straightened from his shoveling, instantly alert. Visitors to his remote cabin were rare even in good weather. During winter, they were almost unheard of. The vehicle sound suggested something larger than a typical car or truck, possibly a county vehicle with the four-wheel drive and clearance necessary to navigate the still challenging roads. "Expecting someone?" Dr. Martinez asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "No one knows I'm here except—" Boone stopped mid-sentence as understanding hit him like a physical blow. The official visit she'd warned him about, the one they'd hoped the storm would delay, was happening now. Someone had been tracking his location more carefully than either of them had realized. The vehicle that emerged from the tree line was indeed a county SUV, followed by a second car that struggled visibly with the snow-packed road. Boone watched with growing dread as both vehicles pulled into his clearing, their occupants clearly prepared for an official intervention. The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of determined expression that spoke to professional ambition and inflexible dedication to procedure. Her companion from the second car was older, a sheriff's deputy whose presence suggested this wasn't a friendly welfare check. "Mr. Carlyle?" The young woman approached with a folder thick enough to suggest extensive documentation. "I'm Linda Chen, Social Services. We've received reports about possible animal welfare concerns at this address." Dr. Martinez moved to stand beside Boone, her professional credentials clearly visible on her jacket. "Dr. Elena Martinez, veterinarian. I can assure you that any animals on this property are receiving excellent care." Linda Chen consulted her paperwork with the thoroughness of someone who trusted documentation more than observation. "We have reports of animal hoarding, possible neglect, and an individual living in isolation who may not be capable of providing proper care." She looked up from her folder with the expression of someone accustomed to finding exactly what she expected to find. "I have a court order authorizing inspection of the premises and removal of any animals found to be in distress." The legal documents she produced were official enough, bearing seals and signatures that carried the weight of institutional authority. Boone felt his carefully constructed world tilting toward collapse as he read the formal language that could separate him from the three creatures who had become his family. But it was the next revelation that truly shattered his understanding of the situation. "Mr. Carlyle, there's also the matter of your property ownership," Linda Chen continued, producing another set of documents. "Our investigation has revealed some irregularities in your land title that need to be addressed." The papers she handed him bore the letterhead of Clearwater Development Corporation, a company Boone had never heard of, but whose intentions were immediately clear from the legal language. According to these documents, his mountain property, the land his family had owned for 3 generations, was being claimed through something called adverse possession proceedings due to unclear title. "Documentation. This is impossible," Boone said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father left me this land. I have the deed. The original deed appears to have been improperly filed," the deputy sheriff explained, with the tone of someone delivering news he didn't enjoy. "There's a gap in the documentation from 1987 that calls the entire ownership chain into question." Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her professional demeanor now carrying an edge of protective anger. "This is quite a coincidence, isn't it? animal welfare concerns and property disputes arising simultaneously. Linda Chen's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes that suggested the timing might not be as coincidental as it appeared. Our department responds to reports as they're filed. The source of this particular complaint wished to remain anonymous, but was quite specific about concerns regarding Mr. Carlyle's ability to properly care for animals. The implications hung in the cold mountain air like a physical presence. Someone had orchestrated this dual attack, using both animal welfare concerns and property law to threaten everything Boone had built. The timing, the coordination between different government agencies, the specific nature of the complaints, none of it felt like the random bureaucratic coincidence it was being presented as. You have 30 days to provide clear documentation of your property ownership, the deputy continued. Until that time, any development or improvement activities on this land must cease, and the animals will need to be removed for evaluation, Linda Chen added, her tone suggesting this wasn't a negotiable point. We have facilities? No. The word came from Boone with such quiet finality that both officials stepped back. Those animals stay with me. Dr. Martinez moved closer, her presence a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. As the attending veterinarian, I can provide immediate documentation of proper care. These animals are healthy, well-fed, and showing excellent recovery from injuries they sustained before Mr. Carlyle rescued them. That may be, Linda Chen replied, but protocol requires that you follow proper procedures, Dr. Martinez interrupted, her voice carrying professional authority, which means allowing the current caregiver to maintain custody while evaluation is conducted, especially when that caregiver has veterinary supervision. The standoff that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though Boone knew it was only minutes. The wind had picked up again, sending snow swirling around the vehicles and reminding everyone that mountain weather didn't respect bureaucratic schedules. Finally, Linda Chen consulted her paperwork once more. Very well. The animals may remain in current custody for 72 hours while we arrange proper evaluation facilities. But Mr. Carlyle, you need to understand that this is a temporary arrangement. As the county vehicles disappeared back down the mountain road, Boone stood in his clearing with Dr. Martinez and felt the full weight of how much his life had changed. A month ago, he had been a solitary man with simple needs and manageable problems. Now he was fighting for custody of 3 animals he loved and ownership of land that represented his family's legacy. From the cabin's porch, 3 puppies watched their humans with the patient trust of creatures who had learned that the people they loved would always come back, would always fight to protect them. We need to find that original deed, Dr. Martinez said quietly. And we need to find it fast. Boone nodded, his mind already turning toward his father's papers, stored somewhere in the chaos of a lifetime's accumulation. Somewhere in those boxes and files was the proof he needed to protect not just his land, but the family he'd never expected to have again. The battle for his sanctuary was about to begin. The 72 hours Linda Chen had given them felt both like an eternity and an instant. Boone spent the first day tearing through every box, drawer, and filing cabinet in his cabin, searching for the documentation that would prove his family's claim to the land. Dr. Martinez helped organize the chaos, her methodical approach bringing order to papers that spanned 3 generations of Carlyle family history. The puppies watched this frantic activity with the concern of creatures who understood that humans were distressed but couldn't comprehend the reasons. Scout, now strong enough for longer periods of activity, followed Boone from room to room as if offering moral support. Ranger had claimed a role as document retriever, bringing Boone scraps of paper that might or might not be relevant. The Guardian maintained its protective watch, though its attention was now focused on the road where unwelcome visitors might return. By sunset, they had found everything except what they needed most, the original deed that would establish clear title to the property. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, tax records, receipts for improvements made over decades, all the documentation of a family's life on the mountain. But not the legal proof that would save it. There has to be something, Dr. Martinez said as they took a break for dinner. Property ownership doesn't just disappear. If your father inherited this land, there's a paper trail somewhere. Boone stared at the photograph of Sarah that still sat on his kitchen table, now surrounded by the evidence of his desperate search. The image that had once brought only pain now seemed to offer something approaching encouragement, as if Sarah's memory was urging him to fight for the life he'd built in her absence. My father wasn't much for paperwork, Boone admitted. He trusted handshake deals and assumed family land would always stay in the family. But there was something. He paused, a memory surfacing from the depths of childhood. He used to talk about important papers being safe from fire and thieves. I always thought he meant the bank, but what if he meant somewhere else? Dr. Martinez finished. Somewhere here on the property? The idea sent Boone's mind racing through memories of his father's habits and hiding places. Samuel Carlyle had been a careful man, but his caution had been shaped by mountain wisdom rather than urban paranoia. He'd hidden things where they would be safe from disaster but accessible when needed. The workshop. Boone hadn't thought about it in years, but his father had spent countless hours in the small building behind the cabin, ostensibly working on repairs and crafts, but often just sitting quietly with his thoughts. If Samuel had wanted to hide something important, the workshop would have been his choice. We'll search it tomorrow, Boone decided, though every instinct urged him to rush out immediately. First light. That evening brought an unexpected visitor that changed everything about their situation. Martha Thompson from the general store arrived just as full darkness settled over the mountain. Her truck struggling through snow that hadn't seen a plow since the storm. Boone, she said as he opened the door. We need to talk. Inside the warm cabin, with the puppies arranged in their usual protective formation around the fireplace, Martha explained what she'd learned during a day of careful inquiries in town. Linda Chen isn't just responding to random complaints, she began, accepting a cup of coffee with grateful hands. Word is, she's been specifically recruited by someone with connections to that development company. The whole animal welfare angle is a setup to get you off the property so they can claim abandonment. Dr. Martinez leaned forward intently. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? Not the kind that would hold up in court, Martha admitted. But my cousin works in the county clerk's office, and she says there's been unusual interest in your property records. Multiple requests for information, all coming from the same legal firm that represents Clearwater Development. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with sickening clarity. Someone wanted Boone's mountain property badly enough to orchestrate an elaborate legal and bureaucratic attack. The timing of the animal welfare complaints, the sudden questions about property ownership, the coordinated pressure from multiple agencies, it was all designed to overwhelm his ability to respond effectively. There's more, Martha continued. Tom Rodriguez told me about a conversation he overheard at the diner last week. Some man in an expensive suit was asking detailed questions about you, whether you had family, how often you came to town, whether anyone would miss you if you just disappeared one day. The words sent a chill through the cabin that had nothing to do with mountain weather. The image of predators circling his sanctuary, looking for weaknesses and vulnerabilities, brought out protective instincts Boone hadn't known he still possessed. Why? He asked. What could they possibly want with mountain land this remote? Mineral rights, Dr. Martinez said quietly. Or water rights? With climate change and development pressure, mountain water sources are becoming incredibly valuable. Martha nodded grimly. There's talk about a major resort development planned for the valley. Golf courses, condominiums, the whole bit. But they'd need water access, and your property controls the headwaters for 3 major streams. The revelation hit Boone like a physical blow. His father's land, chosen for its isolation and beauty, was valuable not for what it was, but for what it could provide to destroy the very wilderness that made it precious. The water that fed his well, that sustained the wildlife he'd spent years learning to understand, was seen by others as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Scout, perhaps sensing his distress, moved closer and rested its head against his leg. The gesture, simple but profound, reminded Boone that this fight wasn't just about property rights or legal principles. It was about protecting a sanctuary where healing could happen, where broken creatures could learn to trust again. "We still have time," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying the determination of someone who'd made a decision to fight. 72 hours to find that deed and document proper animal care. If we can establish both your legal claim to the property and your competence as a caregiver, they'll have no grounds for removal. Martha reached into her coat and pulled out a worn leather folder. "This might help with the animal care documentation. I brought your father's veterinary records from when Doc Henderson was still practicing. Shows a long history of your family providing proper care for animals." The folder contained decades of documentation, vaccinations for working dogs, treatment records for injured wildlife, even notes about Boone's own childhood pets. It painted a picture of a family that had always understood the responsibility that came with caring for other living creatures. But more importantly, it contained something none of them had expected, a hand-drawn map in Samuel Carlyle's careful script, showing the location of what he'd labeled as important family documents, safe storage. The map led to the workshop, just as Boone had suspected, but to a specific location within the building that he'd never thought to examine carefully. A section of floorboards that could be lifted to reveal a hidden compartment his father had built during the cabin's construction. "He was more careful than I realized," Boone said, studying his father's meticulous map. "Tomorrow we'll know whether he was careful enough." Outside, the wind carried the scent of more snow, reminding them that mountain weather could complicate their search. But inside the cabin, surrounded by evidence of his family's long connection to this land and the trust of 3 creatures who depended on his protection, Boone felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: the determination to fight for a future worth having. The Guardian raised its head from where it rested, ears alert to sounds only it could hear. For a moment, the cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then, satisfied that no immediate threat approached, the dog settled back into its protective position. "Tomorrow," Boone said quietly, more to himself than to his companions, "we find out what my father really left me. The battle for his sanctuary would be won or lost in the next 48 hours. But tonight, at least, his family was safe, warm, and together. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them as they had learned to face everything else, with trust, patience, and the quiet strength that came from knowing they no longer had to heal alone. Dawn brought the sound Boone had been dreading, vehicles approaching his mountain sanctuary. Through the cabin windows, he could see the same county SUV from 2 days earlier. But this time, it was accompanied by a larger truck that could only mean one thing: they'd come to take his family away. Dr. Martinez was already dressed and moving, her veterinary bag packed with documentation they'd prepared through the sleepless night. The search of his father's workshop had yielded treasures beyond their hopes, not just the original deed to the property, but a complete chain of ownership stretching back to the 1880s homestead claim that had established his family's legal right to the land. But as Linda Chen stepped out of the lead vehicle, her expression suggested that documentation might not be enough to save them. "Mr. Carlyle," she called across the clearing, her voice carrying an edge of triumph that made Boone's blood run cold. "I'm here for the animals." Behind her came 3 additional people, a county animal control officer, another social worker, and most ominously, a man in an expensive suit who clearly wasn't government personnel. His presence suggested that whatever forces were behind this attack had decided to show themselves openly. The puppies had arranged themselves on the cabin's porch, sensing the tension but refusing to hide. Scout, despite still being the smallest and most fragile, had positioned itself at the front of the group. Ranger maintained its alert stance, ready to respond to whatever came next. The Guardian stood slightly behind its companions, but Boone could see the protective instincts that had never truly relaxed during their recovery. "I have veterinary documentation," Dr. Martinez announced, stepping forward with her folder of records. "These animals are healthy, well cared for, and showing excellent recovery from injuries they sustained before Mr. Carlyle rescued them." Linda Chen barely glanced at the offered papers. "I'm afraid the situation has changed. We've received additional reports about Mr. Carlyle's mental state and his ability to provide proper care. For the safety of the animals, immediate removal is necessary." The man in the expensive suit stepped forward, his smile containing no warmth. "Mr. Carlyle, I'm James Morrison from Clearwater Development. Perhaps we can resolve this situation amicably. We're prepared to offer you fair market value for your property, plus a generous relocation allowance." "This is my home," Boone said quietly, his voice carrying the steady determination that had sustained him through every mountain winter. "These are my animals. You have no right—" "Actually, we do." Morrison produced a document that made Boone's heart sink. "Court order for immediate seizure based on emergency conditions. The animals will be held pending proper evaluation." Dr. Martinez snatched the paper, her eyes scanning the legal language with growing disbelief. "This is based on falsified reports. I can document that every claim in this order is fabricated." "That's for the courts to determine," Linda Chen replied. "Officer Bradley, please secure the animals." The animal control officer, a middle-aged man who looked uncomfortable with his assignment, approached the cabin with the careful movements of someone who understood he was dealing with creatures that might defend themselves. But it was the puppy's response that surprised everyone. Instead of retreating or showing fear, they moved closer together, forming a protective line between the strangers and the cabin door. Scout, despite its small size, stepped forward with a courage that brought tears to Boone's eyes. Ranger positioned itself to guard the flanks, while the Guardian lowered its head in the unmistakable posture of an animal prepared to fight for its family. "They're protecting him," Dr. Martinez said wonderingly. "Look at their body language. They're not afraid of being taken. They're afraid something will happen to Boone." The observation hung in the cold morning air, visible evidence of bonds that couldn't be documented in any official report. These weren't animals being held against their will by an unstable hermit. They were a family that had chosen each other, healed together, and now stood ready to defend what they'd built. Morrison's expression shifted to impatience. "Officer Bradley, we don't have time for sentiment. Execute the court order." As the animal control officer reached for his equipment, Boone felt something break loose inside his chest. Not the familiar pain of loss, but something fiercer and more determined. These creatures had trusted him with their healing, had offered him the gift of their love when he'd thought such connections were impossible. The idea of failing them was unbearable. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone pause. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew the deed his father had hidden so carefully. The document that proved his family's claim to this land stretched back nearly a century and a half. But more importantly, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number Martha Thompson had given him the night before. "This is Boone Carlyle," he said when the call connected. "It's time." Within moments, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the clearing once again. But this time they brought reinforcements Boone had never expected to have, and allies who would change everything about this. Confrontation, the real battle for his sanctuary, was about to begin. The vehicles that emerged from the tree line brought a sight that made James Morrison's confident expression falter. Sheriff Tom Brennan's patrol car led the convoy, followed by Martha Thompson's truck, and behind them a caravan of pickups and SUVs, carrying what appeared to be half the population of the valley. Below, Boone watched in amazement as people he'd barely spoken to in 3 years climbed out of their vehicles and arranged themselves in a protective semicircle around his cabin. Jim Weatherby from the radio station carried a recording device. Tom Rodriguez brought his teenage sons, both tall and strong enough to make the county officials reconsider their assumptions about easy compliance. Dr. Sarah Crow Feather, The tribal elder who had mentored Dr. Martinez emerged from one of the trucks with the dignity of someone who had seen government overreach before and survived it, but it was the document Sheriff Brennan carried that truly changed the dynamics of the confrontation. "Miss Chen," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement, "I have here an injunction from Judge Patricia Wells, issued 1 hour ago, staying all seizure orders pending investigation of fraudulent documentation." Linda Chen's face went pale as she examined the official papers. "This is impossible. Our court order was properly executed, based on falsified reports." Dr. Crow Feather interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet power of someone accustomed to being heard. "Reports that claim Mr. Carlyle is mentally unstable, that his animals are malnourished and abused, that his property poses a public health hazard." She gestured toward the 3 puppies, who were watching the proceedings with alert intelligence. "Anyone with eyes can see these claims are lies." Morrison stepped forward, his expensive suit looking suddenly out of place among the practical winter clothing of the mountain residents. "This is highly irregular. Clearwater Development has followed all proper legal procedures, including bribing county officials." Sheriff Brennan asked mildly, "Because we have some interesting recordings of conversations between your company and certain government employees. Recordings that suggest this entire situation was orchestrated to force Mr. Carlyle off his property." Jim Weatherby held up his recording device with a grim smile. "Amazing what people will say when they think no one's listening. Your man Rogers was particularly chatty about the financial incentives involved in this operation." The revelation hung in the cold morning air like a visible presence. Morrison's confident facade cracked as he realized how thoroughly his conspiracy had been exposed. Linda Chen looked between her superiors and the gathered crowd, with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand she'd been used as a pawn in someone else's game. But it was Dr. Martinez who delivered the final blow to their case. "I have here," she announced, pulling a thick folder from her bag, "complete veterinary documentation spanning the past month. Medical records, treatment notes, photographic evidence of healing progression, and testimony from multiple witnesses who have observed Mr. Carlyle's exemplary care of these animals." She handed the folder to Sheriff Brennan, but her next words were directed at Linda Chen. "I also have documented evidence that the original complaint about animal welfare was filed by someone using a false name and address, someone connected to Clearwater Development who has never set foot on this property." The crowd of supporters murmured their approval, but Boone's attention remained fixed on the 3 puppies who had started this entire journey. Scout had moved to sit directly beside his leg, offering comfort with the intuitive understanding that had marked their relationship from the beginning. Ranger was investigating the newcomers with cautious curiosity, its natural friendliness beginning to overcome protective wariness. The Guardian maintained its alert stance, but Boone could see the tension leaving its shoulders as it recognized that these strangers meant no harm to its family. Morrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage his scheme. Even if the animal welfare complaints are dismissed, the property ownership issues remain unresolved. Mr. Carlyle still cannot prove clear title. Actually, he can. Martha Thompson stepped forward with a manila envelope that contained copies of every document they'd found in Samuel Carlyle's hidden cache. Original homestead claim from 1887, properly filed deed transfers, tax records spanning 3 generations, and mineral rights documentation that specifically excludes any claims by development companies. She handed the envelope to Sheriff Brennan with satisfaction. "Judge Wells has already reviewed these documents and confirmed their validity. Mr. Carlyle's ownership of this property is unquestionable. The land deed itself, yellowed with age, but bearing all the proper seals and signatures, represented more than legal ownership. It was proof of his family's commitment to this mountain, evidence of roots that ran too deep to be severed by corporate greed or bureaucratic manipulation." Linda Chen closed her folder with the defeated gesture of someone who realized she'd been fighting on the wrong side. Given these developments, I'll be recommending that all animal welfare proceedings be dismissed. Morrison's retreat was less graceful. He stalked back to his vehicle with the anger of someone whose carefully laid plans had been destroyed by the simple power of community standing together against injustice. As the county vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Boone found himself surrounded by neighbors who had become something more, a chosen family that understood what he'd been fighting to protect. The sanctuary was safe. His family was whole, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Boone understood that healing didn't have to happen alone. 6 months later, Boone stood in his workshop putting the finishing touches on a wooden sign that would mark the entrance to his property. The carved letters read, "Carlisle Animal Sanctuary," in his father's careful style, each word shaped with the patience that mountain craftsmanship required. Below the main text, smaller script added, "Where healing happens together." The workshop itself had been transformed since that desperate search for his father's hidden documents. What had once been a cluttered storage space was now organized as both a treatment facility for injured animals and a meeting place for the community of supporters who had rallied to his defense. Dr. Martinez made regular visits, combining veterinary care with lessons in wilderness medicine that honored both modern knowledge and traditional wisdom. Through the workshop's windows, Boone could see the 3 dogs that had started this transformation. Scout, now fully grown and healthy, had developed into a natural therapy animal with an intuitive understanding of which creatures needed gentle encouragement and which required respectful space. The former injury that had nearly cost its life was now invisible, leaving only a slight scar on its ear that Boone had learned to see as a mark of survival rather than damage. Ranger had grown into its curiosity, becoming the sanctuary's unofficial greeter and investigator. Any new arrival, whether human or animal, received Ranger's thorough but gentle inspection before being approved for entry into the healing community. Its natural friendliness had proven invaluable in helping frightened animals learn that this place offered safety rather than threat. The Guardian had evolved into exactly what its protective instincts had always suggested, a leader among the sanctuary's growing population of rescued animals, now a magnificent adult with the confidence of a creature that had found its purpose. It moved through the property with quiet authority, ensuring that newer arrivals understood the rules of mutual respect and shared healing that governed life at the sanctuary. The sanctuary itself had grown beyond anything Boone had imagined when he'd first brought 3 injured puppies home from an auction. Word had spread through informal networks of people who cared about animals that needed second chances. Injured wildlife found their way to his mountain through the referrals of park rangers and tribal members who understood that sometimes official facilities couldn't provide what damaged creatures truly needed. A young elk with a damaged leg had spent 3 months learning to trust humans again after being injured by poachers. 2 horses, rescued from a neglect situation, had rediscovered their confidence in the patient presence of dogs who understood what it meant to heal from trauma. An elderly cat, too sick for anyone else to want, had lived out its final months in comfort and dignity before passing peacefully in the warmth of Boone's cabin. But perhaps the most significant change was in Boone himself. The isolated hermit who had fled human contact after losing his family had gradually become a respected member of a community he'd never expected to join. Martha Thompson brought supplies regularly, often staying for coffee and updates on the sanctuary's newest residents. Jim Weatherby featured the sanctuary's success stories on his radio program, helping other damaged animals find their way to safety. Dr. Martinez had become more than a veterinary consultant. She was a partner in creating something unprecedented in their mountain valley. Together, they had developed protocols that combined the best of modern animal medicine with the patient, holistic approach that Boone's father had practiced. Their work was attracting attention from veterinary schools and animal welfare organizations who wanted to study their methods. The legal victory over Clearwater. Development had done more than save Boone's property. It had exposed a pattern of corruption that led to criminal charges and the dissolution of the development project. The water rights that had made his land so valuable remained protected, ensuring that the streams flowing through his property would continue to support both wildlife and the growing network of small ranches that depended on clean mountain water. On quiet evenings, Boone often found himself sitting on his porch with Sarah's photograph nearby, telling her about the day's events. The conversations that had once been exercises in grief had transformed into something approaching hope. He described Scout's gentle patience with a traumatized kitten, Ranger's success in coaxing a frightened rabbit to accept food, the Guardian's protective care of animals too weak to protect themselves. "You would have loved this," he told her picture as the sun set behind the peaks. All these creatures finding their way to healing, learning to trust again. It's what you always said this place could be. A sanctuary where broken things could become whole. The wooden sign was ready now, waiting to be installed at the property's entrance, where visitors could see it clearly. But more than marking territory, it represented a promise that this mountain would always offer refuge to creatures that needed time and patience to heal. The Carlyle family legacy had evolved from simple land ownership to something more profound, stewardship of a place where healing happened not through isolation, but through connection. As darkness settled over the sanctuary, Boone made his evening rounds, checking on the various animals that now called his mountain home. In the converted barn, horses settled into comfortable sleep. In the outdoor enclosures, smaller creatures found warmth in carefully designed shelters. Throughout the property, the quiet sounds of healing life created a symphony that spoke to the power of second chances. Scout, Ranger, and the Guardian accompanied him on these rounds. 3 constant companions whose own healing journey had shown him that recovery was possible even after the deepest wounds. They had saved him as much as he had saved them, proving that sometimes the most broken souls do indeed find each other in the most unexpected places. The sanctuary was more than a place now. It was a living testament to the truth that healing, whether from physical injury or emotional trauma, happened best when no one had to face it alone. And every morning brought the possibility of another chance to save what others had given up on, to prove that worth wasn't measured by perfection, but by the capacity to love and be loved in return.